Have you ever felt utterly exhausted from having to brace yourself as the sole commander of your own life? We so often force the ego, the small island of consciousness, to carry the entire weight of the world, only to find that when night falls, all that remains is a sense of disorientation and emptiness. Carl Jung warned that modern human beings live as if they are walking in shoes that are too tight, so preoccupied with what the eye is calculating that they forget to listen to what the inner universe of the soul is truly trying to say. Hello, my friend. I am Milo, and I will be accompanying you through the hours ahead. This video is not merely an invitation into restful sleep. It is a sacred rite, one that allows you to reconnect with your true center. Tonight, I invite you to release the weary need for control of the ego and touch the power of the self, the wellspring of wholeness and wisdom that has existed since the dawn of humanity. Do you have the courage to shed the social masks and face the most elusive treasure of all your own authentic being? Do not sleep to forget reality. Sleep to remember who you truly are. Take a slow, gentle breath. Become fully present and allow the current of the unconscious to guide you back to the greater human who is waiting within your heart. Imagine your ego as a small helmsman steering a vessel across a vast ocean. Tonight, let the helmsman rest and allow the ship to surrender itself to the majestic rhythm of the sea of the unconscious. Each night, when your eyes close, something very strange happens. The world does not disappear. It simply steps back. Images, sounds, roles, and responsibilities slowly dissolve like a thin mist. And in that moment, when you no longer have to be someone for anyone else, a silent door opens. Jung did not describe this as the shutting down of consciousness, but as a shift in the center of awareness from the noisy surface of daytime life into the deep and ancient current of the soul. We have grown accustomed to thinking of sleep as emptiness, an interruption, a dark interval not worth remembering. But Jung saw the opposite. Sleep is a threshold, a delicate boundary where consciousness releases its grip and the unconscious begins to speak. It is no coincidence that he wrote, "The unconscious is not a second personality. It is a world in itself." Collected Works, Volume 7. When you sleep, you do not fall into nothingness. You enter another world, a world to which you have belonged for a very long time, even before you learned how to name yourself. Modern human beings are exhausted not only because they lack sleep, but because they lack return. We live too long on the surface of consciousness, thinking, analyzing, controlling, planning. The ego, the waking self, becomes a tense gatekeeper, unwilling to leave its post. But Jung warned that when the ego refuses to step aside, the soul will find other ways to speak. Groundless anxiety, depression, haunting dreams, a nameless sense of emptiness. He wrote with striking clarity, "The greatest danger threatening us is the loss of meaning. Civilization in transition. And it is precisely at the threshold of sleep that meaning begins to return, not as a concept to be understood, but as an experience to be lived. When you lie down, when the body grows heavier, when the breath slows, an ancient ritual is taking place. No temple is required. No prayer is needed. Only permission. Permission for the weary ego to rest. Permission for layers of control to dissolve. Permission not to become anything, but simply to be. Jung called this process a descent, a necessary going down, not a descent into collapse, but a descent toward the roots. He said, "One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious." Alchemical studies. Sleep is the first darkness we enter each day. But it is not a threatening darkness. It is the darkness of the womb, of the primordial cave, of the place where all forms of life were once held and nurtured. In that darkness, nothing is demanded of you. You are not required to prove anything. You are not judged. You are received exactly as you are. We do not sleep in order to forget. This statement runs counter to habitual thinking. But Jung understood that the deepest memory does not reside in recall, but in the identity of the soul. When we sleep, we remember in another way. We remember the feeling of belonging. We remember natural rhythm. We remember the wholeness that existed before the world required us to fragment ourselves into countless roles. He wrote, "Who looks outside dreams, who looks inside awakes." Psychological types. Sleep, paradoxically, becomes a form of awakening. Not an awakening of the intellect, but of depth. There the questions: who am I? What is my worth? What must I do next? No longer require answers. They dissolve, giving way to a quieter knowing. I am here, and that is enough. The threshold between the two worlds does not ask for courage. It asks only that you let go. Let go of the final efforts to control sleep. Let go of the need to sleep correctly. Let go even of the desire to be healed immediately. Jung reminds us that true transformation always occurs when the ego no longer stands at the center. And thus sleep becomes a sacred ritual, not in a religious sense, but in the deepest human sense. It is the moment each day when you are permitted to return to the most authentic part of yourself, the part not defined by success or failure, by past or future. At that threshold, you do not need to do anything more. You only need to step across. The rest, your soul already knows the way. When you have crossed the threshold of sleep, where the weary ego finally loosens its grip, a new space slowly comes into view. There, the question is no longer, how do I fall asleep? But a quieter and deeper curiosity. What truly exists within me? From that silence, the next journey begins. If Chapter 1 is the moment of stepping across the boundary between two worlds, then Chapter 2 is the invitation to behold the full landscape of your inner world, a vast, ancient, and more vivid map than anything we were ever taught about ourselves. Jung called this world the Psyche, but in his understanding, the psyche is not an abstract concept, nor a container for thoughts. It is the totality of psychological reality, encompassing both the light of consciousness and the darkness of the unconscious. Everything we know about ourselves, and everything that continues to operate silently beneath the surface. He wrote, "The psyche is the greatest of all cosmic wonders." Collected Works, Volume 8. Modern human beings tend to identify themselves with consciousness. We believe that I am the thoughts occurring in my mind, the memories I can recall, the story I tell about myself. But Jung emphasized that consciousness is only a very small part of the entire psychic life. He likened it to a tiny point of light in the vast ocean of the unconscious, sufficient to navigate the daytime world, but utterly insufficient to explain the whole human being. To help us imagine this, Jung often used spatial imagery. The psyche is like an ancient tower. At its highest level, bathed in light, is present consciousness, our thoughts, decisions, roles, and identities as we live them each day. This is the bright attic, where everything appears clear, where the ego feels it is in control. But as we descend the staircase, the space begins to change. The lower levels are where old memories reside, experiences that were once significant but have since been forgotten, emotions that were repressed because they were inappropriate, unacceptable, or too painful to face. Jung called this realm the personal unconscious, not because it is alien, but because it was once conscious and then left behind. He wrote, "The unconscious contains all sorts of things which are suppressed or forgotten." Collected Works, Volume 7. Yet the tower does not end there. In the deepest basement levels, where the light of personal life no longer reaches, lie contents that never belonged to you alone. There exist ancient images, patterns of behavior and feeling accumulated through millions of years of human evolution. This is where Jung located the collective unconscious, the shared inheritance of humanity, not learned, not taught, yet alive in every dream, fear, longing, and myth. Jung wrote a pivotal line. In addition to our immediate consciousness, which is of a thoroughly personal nature, there exists a second psychic system of a collective, universal, and impersonal nature. The archetypes and the collective unconscious. What matters is this: the psyche is not static. It is not a dead archive. It is a living, energetic system, constantly in motion, constantly seeking balance. When consciousness moves too far in one direction, too rational, too controlling, too detached from feeling, the unconscious compensates through dreams, symptoms, or nameless feelings of unease. Not to punish, but to return the person to a natural axis of balance. The problem is that we usually live on only one level of the tower. We decorate the attic, expand our view, but never descend the stairs. Jung believed this to be the true source of modern exhaustion, not because the psyche is flawed, but because we have severed our relationship with most of ourselves. He warned man's task is to become conscious of the contents that press upward from the unconscious, the structure and dynamics of the psyche. To understand the psyche, therefore, is not to accumulate more knowledge. It is to change the ego's position. From a ruler at the highest level, the ego learns to become a more humble observer, aware that it is only one part of a much larger whole. When this shift occurs, a deeper order begins to be felt within inner life, an order not created by will, yet profoundly meaningful. And within this context, sleep is no longer the shutting down of consciousness, but a doorway leading down into the deeper levels of the tower. Each night, when you surrender to sleep, the psyche continues its work. It reorganizes energy, heals invisible fractures, and reminds you that you are far greater than what you believe yourself to be during the day. Jung once wrote, "The unconscious is not only evil by nature, it is also the source of the highest good, psychology, and religion. The map of the soul, therefore, is not meant to be conquered. It is not a maze to be solved, but a universe to be respected. You do not need to descend every level in a single night. It is enough to know that they exist. It is enough to allow yourself to acknowledge that your inner life is deeper, more ancient, and more intelligent than the ego that strives to control everything. And when you begin to see the psyche in this way, something essential happens. You no longer feel alone within yourself. You realize that inside you exists an entire world alive listening, and waiting to be connected. From that moment, the next journey becomes inevitable. Because once you have seen the map, you begin to recognize parts of yourself that you had long overlooked or deliberately refused to see. And that is when the train driver, called the ego, comes into clearer view, small necessary, but not the whole journey, as the map of the soul gradually comes into view within the stillness of sleep. A simple yet profound truth begins to reveal itself. The part we habitually call me occupies only a very small corner of that vast inner universe. From the moment we recognize that the psyche is more than consciousness alone, the next question arises naturally. Who stands at the center of our waking life? Each day, Jung gives this answer a name: the ego. The ego is the center of consciousness. It is where thoughts follow one another, where memories are arranged into a narrative, where the sense of I am me is maintained from one day to the next. Through the ego, human beings can orient themselves in time, make decisions, and take responsibility for their actions. Jung never denied this essential role. He wrote clearly, "The ego is the subject of all personal acts of consciousness." Collected Works, Volume 7. Yet Jung simultaneously emphasized a crucial limitation. The ego is not the whole person. It is like a ship as a pilot, standing on the deck, seeing the surface of the sea, adjusting the course, and believing he commands the journey. Beneath the vessel, however, lies a deep ocean, the unconscious with currents, tides, and forces the pilot can never fully control. Modern human beings often make a dangerous mistake identifying themselves with the ego. We believe we are what we think, the choices we make, the story we tell about ourselves. Jung argued that this very identification is the source of much psychological suffering. When the ego believes itself to be the absolute captain, everything beyond its control becomes a threat. Anxiety, fear, obsession with success or failure all arise from the ego's attempt to maintain total control. Jung warned of this with a sharp observation. So long as the ego is identified with the self, it is impossible to reach the deeper layers of the psyche. Collected Works, Volume 9. The ego gives us a sense of identity and continuity. It allows us to say, "This is me. This is my life story." Yet for that very reason, the ego is also fragile. It needs protection, recognition, and validation. And when the world fails to meet those needs, the ego responds with tension, defensiveness, or collapse. Jung did not view this as weakness. He saw it as the natural condition of a small center of consciousness striving to remain upright within a vast ocean of the unconscious. The image of an island is a precise Jungian metaphor. The ego is the island rising above the water, illuminated by light, where everything appears clear. But that island exists only because of the ocean surrounding it. Without the unconscious, the ego would have no foundation, no energy, no depth. Jung wrote, "The ego lives in perpetual dependence upon the unconscious. The relations between the ego and the unconscious. The problem is not that the ego exists, but that it forgets its place. When the ego believes itself to be the absolute center, it begins to resist signals rising from the unconscious, strange dreams, irrational emotions, inexplicable impulses." Jung believed this is when the psyche begins to lose balance, not because the unconscious is rebelling, but because the ego refuses to listen. Sleep plays a special role in this relationship. Each night, when the ego grows weary and control loosens, the pilot is forced to release the helm. The ship continues to move, but no longer according to daytime logic. Jung saw sleep as a natural mechanism through which the ego learns humility. There, the ego is not erased, but restored to its proper position as part of the whole, not its master. He wrote a foundational sentence: "The unconscious can make a fool of the ego." Collected Works, Volume 7. This statement is not mocking, it is liberating. When the ego accepts that it is not omnipotent, a new space opens for psychological growth. The pilot begins to learn how to read the wind and the waves, rather than attempting to impose his will upon the ocean. This is the first step toward a healthy relationship between consciousness and the unconscious. Jung did not call for the destruction of the ego. On the contrary, he believed a sufficiently strong ego is a necessary condition for the journey into depth. But strong here does not mean rigid or controlling. It means the capacity to endure uncertainty, the ability to remain with what is unclear without panic. He wrote, "A weak ego is more easily overwhelmed by the unconscious." Collected Works, Volume 6. Therefore, the ego must be strengthened, but not to dominate, rather to enter into dialogue. When the ego learns to listen to the unconscious, a deeper intelligence begins to be felt at work within. Not every decision needs to be thought through to the end. Not every emotion needs to be explained immediately. At times, wisdom lies in allowing the ship to drift with the safe currents of the inner ocean. Here, the image of the pilot becomes more complete. The ego remains necessary to adjust to respond when needed to keep the ship from striking hidden rocks. But the journey is no longer a battle between control and chaos. It becomes a quiet cooperation between the light of consciousness and the depth of the unconscious. And when you understand the ego in this way, something essential happens. You begin to be less harsh with yourself. You no longer see moments of disorientation as personal failure. You understand that larger currents are at work, and that your task is not to fight them, but to learn how to move with them. From this point, the journey will continue downward, not to weaken the ego, but to allow it to encounter the parts that were once neglected, pushed into the shadows. For only when the pilot dares to look at what he has avoided can the ship travel more fully across the sea of inner life. When the pilot called, the ego begins to understand that it is not the absolute owner of the ship. Another door opens. No longer is the gaze fixed from the deck toward the open sea. Instead, there is a descent into the inner hold, where engines operate silently, where the hum is not loud, yet determines the entire direction of travel. This is the moment we touch the personal unconscious, the first deep layer beneath consciousness, the closest and most familiar, yet also the most forgotten. Jung described the personal unconscious as the place that contains everything that once belonged to consciousness but no longer appears in its light. These are faint childhood memories, emotions once too intense to endure conflicts that were pushed aside because they were inappropriate, forbidden, or unsafe. He wrote, "The personal unconscious contains lost memories, painful ideas that are repressed, subliminal perceptions, and other contents that are not conscious." Collected Works, Volume 7. What matters is this: these contents do not disappear. They merely change position. They leave the light of consciousness and continue to live in the shadows, where they need no permission to influence our behavior, reactions, and choices. Human beings often believe they act for rational reasons, but Jung argued that many of our responses arise from layers of memory we no longer remember, while the body and emotions remember them all too well. Within the personal unconscious, Jung identified a key phenomenon he called complexes. These are not merely psychological problems, but clusters of emotion, memory, and imagery bound together around an experience of strong intensity. He described them with a vivid image. Complexes are splinter psyches. Collected Works, Vol. 8. Complexes function like invisible magnets. When a present situation touches their particular frequency, the entire old emotional system is activated in an instant. You react more strongly than necessary. You feel hurt, angry, ashamed, or afraid without knowing why. Jung emphasized that in such moments, the ego is no longer fully in command. He wrote, We are not in control. We are controlled. Collected Works, Volume 8. This may sound frightening, but Jung did not regard it as tragic. He regarded it as a truth that must be recognized. The personal unconscious is not the enemy of the ego. It is the repository of unlived lives, emotions never named, experiences never fully digested. When the ego ignores them, they find other paths to speak, most often through symptoms, dreams, or painfully repetitive relationships. Jung wrote a sentence that has become famous. Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate. Collected Works, Volume 10. Within the context of the personal unconscious, this statement takes on particular depth. The fate we so often lament is in many cases nothing more than an unrecognized memory or a misunderstood complex. We love the same kind of person. We fear the same kinds of situations. We react in the same ways, not because we are weak, but because a part of us learned how to survive very early on and was never updated afterward. Sleep is the natural doorway into this realm. When the ego rests, the personal unconscious gains space to reorganize scattered fragments of memory. Strange dream images, emotions with no clear origin upon waking all, are the language of forgotten parts seeking to return to the light. Jung did not advise us to analyze dreams mechanically. He advised us to listen. Dreams are the direct expression of unconscious psychic activity. Collected Works, Volume 8. At this level of the psyche, the motive is not control, but recognition. When the ego begins to see its complexes without judgment, without rushing to fix them, something crucial occurs. Trapped energy begins to be released. Jung believed that much vitality is lost, not because the world is too harsh, but because the inner life is divided. Each complex is a pocket of isolated energy, not yet integrated into the overall flow of the person. He wrote, "Every complex has its own energy, which can be released when it is made conscious." Collected Works, Volume 8. This explains why remembering, or more precisely, allowing oneself to remember, has healing power. Not to relive the pain, but to place it in its proper position within the story of one's life. The personal unconscious does not seek to dominate. It seeks acknowledgement. When that happens, the ego does not weaken. On the contrary, it becomes steadier, no longer having to resist invisible forces pulling from below. Here, we begin to grasp a central insight of Jungian psychology. Human beings do not mature by eliminating the past, but by bringing the past into the present consciously. The personal unconscious is the bridge between the present ego and one's individual history. If the tree of life does not root itself in the soil, it will fall when strong winds arise. When you pass through this level of the psyche, you do not become a different person. You become a person who is less pulled about. Reactions become less extreme. Emotions become less overwhelming, not because you control them better, but because the parts once pushed into darkness have been invited back into dialogue. And as personal memories are gradually named as complexes begin to emerge, a deeper question naturally arises, for not every image in the unconscious comes from your individual history. There are symbols, fears, and longings that have never belonged to you personally, yet live within you, as though you have carried them for a very long time. That is when the journey must descend even further into the layer where memory no longer bears a personal name, where the human being touches the shared inheritance of all humanity. As personal memories are gradually named as complexes begin to emerge and loosen their grip from the shadows, a very strange sensation arises. Not everything stirring within us bears the imprint of our individual history. There are images, fears, and longings that seem older than a single lifetime. They are not attached to any specific memory, yet they feel uncannily familiar, as if they have lived within us for a very long time. At this point, the journey can no longer remain within the personal unconscious. It must go deeper into the layer Jung called the collective unconscious. If the personal unconscious is the treasury of what once belonged to individual life, then the collective unconscious is the psychological inheritance of all humanity. Jung advanced a bold thesis that ran counter to much of the psychological thinking of his time. Beneath all personal experience, human beings share a common layer of mind, not learned through education, not transmitted through language, but inherited as part of our psychic structure. He wrote, "The collective unconscious is a part of the psyche, which can be distinguished from a personal unconscious by the fact that it does not owe its existence to personal experience. The archetypes and the collective unconscious. This means that when you fear the dark, feel stirred by the image of the mother, become overwhelmed by power, or are drawn to heroic stories, you are not responding solely from your personal history. You are touching ancient patterns embedded in the human psyche through millions of years of evolution. Jung called these patterns archetypes. Archetypes are not fixed images. They are patterns, forms of energy that tend to express themselves through images, emotions, and behaviors. Each culture may tell different stories, yet the underlying structure is strikingly similar. The nurturing mother, the stern father, the hero, setting out on a journey, the shadow that must be faced, death and rebirth. These motifs appear in every civilization, from ancient mythologies to the dreams of modern individuals. Jung observed, archetypes are typical forms of behavior, which once they become conscious, naturally present themselves as ideas and images. The structure and dynamics of the psyche. The collective unconscious, therefore, is not an abstract idea. It is alive. It is present in dreams we cannot explain through personal experience, in instinctive reactions to danger, in the sense of the sacred when standing before overwhelming nature, and even in the groundless panic of modern life. Jung believed that when human beings lose contact with this deep layer, they do not become freer, but more alienated. He issued a powerful warning. Man has never known himself as he really is, for he has always lived in the shadow of the gods. Psychology and religion. Here the gods are not external, supernatural beings, but archetypal forces operating within the psyche. When these forces are denied, they do not disappear. They merely become unnamed, and therefore more dangerous. Jung observed this not only in individuals, but in entire societies. He recognized that extreme collective movements, political frenzies, and outbreaks of mass violence are often expressions of archetypes activated without being made conscious. Yet on the personal level, the collective unconscious is not only a source of darkness, it is also the source of our deepest meaning. From here, human beings discover a sense of belonging, not merely to family or nation, but to the long continuum of humanity itself. When someone feels that life is meaningful, it is often because they have touched an archetype: the caregiver, the seeker, the protector, the pilgrim. Sleep opens a special doorway into this layer. In dreams, powerful symbolic images appear without asking permission from the ego. An ancient house, a snake, a wise old man, a strange child. These are not random products of a tired brain. Jung emphasized, dreams are the most common and universally accessible source for the investigation of man's symbolizing faculty. Man and his symbols. These symbols are the language of the collective unconscious. They do not need to be understood literally. They need to be felt and placed in relation to the dreamer, a present life. When the ego is humble enough to listen, the collective unconscious does not overwhelm it, guides. The problem of modern humanity is not a lack of information, but a loss of contact with symbolic depth. We live in a world that explains everything with data, yet we do not know what to do with dreams, groundless fears, or nameless longings. Jung believed that this imbalance dries out the psyche, and when depth is starved, it will reclaim attention in extreme ways. He wrote, "The more a man is, life is shaped by the collective norms, the greater is his individual immorality. The undiscovered self." This statement is not a condemnation of society, but a subtle reminder. Human beings must relate to the collective unconscious consciously, rather than dissolve into it. When we recognize the archetypes at work, we are no longer swept along blindly by them. We learn to enter into dialogue with the inheritance of our ancestors, rather than being governed by it from behind the scenes. The collective unconscious is humanity's wordless memory. It carries both primordial fear and accumulated wisdom. When you touch this layer, even briefly in a dream or a moment of the sacred, you do not become smaller. You become supported, for you understand that your pain, your confusion, and your search for meaning have never been a solitary personal affair. And when archetypes begin to be recognized, when these ancient forces step gradually into the light of consciousness, a new challenge emerges. From this point on, it is no longer only about understanding the depths, but about how a human being appears in the world after carrying within both light and the inherited legacy of shadow. It is precisely at this point of intersection that the mask we wear each day begins to reveal its role, both as a necessary bridge and as a potential veil that obscures the true person behind it. As the archetypal forces of the collective unconscious are gradually recognized as human beings, become more aware of the ancient currents moving within them, a very practical question arises. How do these depths enter the outer world? At the point of intersection between inner depth and social life, Jung named an indispensable structure, the persona, the mask. The persona is not deception. It is a bridge. It is the form the psyche uses to meet the world. Every social role, the child, the father, the mother, the leader, the employee, the friend, demands a different mode of expression. The persona enables us to adapt, to communicate, to be accepted. Jung spoke plainly about its necessity. The persona is that which in reality one is not, but which oneself, as well as others, think one is. 2 essays on analytical psychology. So long as it remains a flexible role, the persona protects the individual from excessive intrusion by the world. It allows us to keep distance, maintain order, preserve rhythm. The problem is not wearing a mask, but forgetting that one is wearing it. Danger begins when a person completely identifies with the persona. When the ego believes I am this role, the psyche is reduced to a thin image designed to please others. Jung warned that such identification not only causes exhaustion, but drains vital energy. He wrote, "When the persona is rigid and over-identification with it occurs, the individual is cut off from his inner life." Collected Works, Volume 7. Modern human beings are particularly vulnerable to this trap. The outer world constantly demands be stronger, more successful, more positive, more okay. The persona thickens with every demand, the well-timed smile, the safe response, the appropriate attitude. And gradually, the inner voice is no longer heard, not because it has vanished, but because it no longer has space to resound. Jung did not regard the persona as the enemy of development. He saw it as a stage, a necessary step in the process of maturation. But he emphasized that this process is healthy only when the persona does not occupy the center. When the role becomes identity, the psyche responds with warning signals: emptiness, loss of meaning, psychological exhaustion, or a sorrow that cannot be named. He observed a man cannot get rid of the persona without serious injury to his social adaptation, but he can reduce it to its proper place. The relations between the ego and the unconscious. This requires great subtlety. It is not about tearing off all masks and living authentically in a NIV way. It is about recognizing when we speak from a role, when we remain silent out of fear of shattering an image, when we act for approval rather than from fidelity to ourselves. Once again, sleep becomes a safe space for such recognition. When the persona loosens, when roles dissolve in gentle darkness, the psyche returns to a more natural state. In dreams, we rarely appear with social titles. We are not positions, images, or roles. We are figures, symbols, emotions. Jung believed that it is here that imbalance between the persona and inner life becomes most visible. He wrote, "Dreams are the compensatory reaction of the unconscious to the conscious mind." Collected Works, Volume 8. If the persona is too rigid by day, the unconscious compensates at night with strange, even disturbing dreams, not as punishment, but as a reminder there is another human being waiting to be lived. At a deeper level, identification with the persona produces a subtler consequence. Those parts that do not fit the role are pushed into darkness. Emotions one should not have. Thoughts one is not allowed to think. Impulses that do not match the image all are set aside. Jung saw here the seed of a larger conflict within the psyche. The more perfect the persona, the more energy accumulates in what is excluded. He wrote a pivotal line: "The brighter the light, the darker the shadow." Collected Works, Volume 9. The persona, therefore, is both the facade of social life and the boundary that creates the shadow. And when a person lives only at that facade, the cost is not merely fatigue, but loss of contact with wholeness. What Jung invited was not rebellion against society, but a reordering of the inner hierarchy. The persona must be placed where it belongs, like a garment we put on when needed, not a skin we can never remove. When this happens, a deep relief begins to be felt. We still fulfill our roles, but without trading away the soul. We still communicate, but without self-betrayal. Here, motivation does not come from hollow calls to be yourself. It arises from a quieter truth: you are permitted to be more than one role. You do not have to shrink yourself to fit the world's expectations. Jung emphasized that psychological maturity is not becoming perfect in a role, but maintaining a living connection with what lies beyond it. And when the persona is seen for what it truly is, when the role no longer obscures the real person, another door must open. For the excluded parts, rejected emotions, buried instincts do not disappear. They wait on the other side of the light, in the place Jung called the shadow. Only by turning back to face what the persona has concealed can a human being take another step on the journey toward wholeness. When the mask is restored to its proper place as a necessary role rather than an identity, an inevitable movement occurs within the psyche. What was once hidden to protect a social image begins to demand the right to exist. At the boundary between the light of the persona and the excluded depths, Jung named an unavoidable figure the shadow. The shadow is not pure evil. It is the twin sibling of consciousness, born at the same time as the persona, growing from what the persona cannot carry. Each time a person says, "I am not that kind of person," a portion of the shadow is formed. Each time an emotion is labeled unacceptable, too ugly, or too weak, it slips into the darkness. Jung wrote a brief but direct line: "The shadow is a moral problem that challenges the whole ego personality." Ion. The shadow is the repository of rejected parts. Yet, for that very reason, it is also a reservoir of unused life energy. Jung often likened the shadow to black gold, rough and dirty at first glance, yet containing the fuel of creativity, vitality, and authenticity. When human beings strive too hard to be right, good, and acceptable, they often lose this raw life force. And the psyche, unwilling to tolerate imbalance, will seek to bring the shadow back, often through uncomfortable paths. Jung warned, "One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious." Alchemical studies. This statement does not call for sinking into darkness, but for facing it. The shadow does not need to be worshipped. It needs to be seen. When the ego refuses to look, the shadow does not disappear. It changes form projection. We see evil in others. We react violently to qualities we refuse to acknowledge in ourselves. We hate, despise, or fear excessively. Jung spoke plainly. Everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves. Collected Works. Volume 7. Projection is how the shadow speaks when it is forbidden a voice. And modern society, with its rigid moral standards and idealized images, is fertile ground for this mechanism. The harder people try to appear clean, the more energy the shadow accumulates. Eventually, it erupts in inexplicable anger, self-destructive behavior, painfully repetitive relationships, or a sense of emptiness that cannot be explained. Yet Jung was not despairing about the shadow. He regarded the encounter with it as an indispensable turning point in psychological maturity. No one becomes whole by living only in the light. Wholeness is the capacity to contain opposites without breaking apart. He wrote, "The acceptance of oneself is the essence of the moral problem and the acid test of one's whole outlook on life." Collected Works, Volume 11. Integrating the shadow does not mean acting out every impulse. It means taking responsibility for what exists within. When a person acknowledges their anger, they no longer need violence to conceal it. When a person acknowledges envy, they can learn from the buried longing beneath it. When a person acknowledges vulnerability, they no longer have to wear the armor of the persona at all times. Sleep is a privileged space for this encounter. In dreams, the shadow often appears in disturbing forms: a stranger, a pursuer, a wild animal, or a distorted version of oneself. Jung did not advise us to destroy these images. He advised dialogue. Dreams are the natural expression of the unconscious psyche. Collected Works, Volume 8. When the ego is strong enough to remain with discomfort without fleeing, something strange occurs. The shadow loses some of its power, not because it is defeated, but because it is acknowledged. Energy, once tightly locked away, is released for creativity, authenticity, and the capacity to live more deeply. Jung believed that many artists, thinkers, and highly vital individuals are those who have, in one way or another, made peace with their shadow. He warned a difficult truth. no tree, it is said, can grow to heaven unless its roots reach down to hell. Psychology and religion. This line does not romanticize suffering. It reminds us that the height of consciousness is proportional to the depth of acceptance. A person who wants only light will live superficially. A person who dares to descend, to see, to accept, will live with depth and weight. In the context of motivation, this is a countercultural message. You do not need to become better by eliminating what is bad. You need to become more whole by integrating what has been abandoned. This does not weaken you. It makes you less controlled from behind the scenes. When the shadow is brought into the light of consciousness, the ego no longer has to strain to maintain an image. A deep relief emerges, not excitement, but truth. And when the shadow has been recognized as part of the whole, when buried energy begins to flow again, the psyche naturally moves toward a new balance. No longer a battle between light and darkness, but a reconciliation of opposites. From this point of reconciliation, a subtle transition occurs. The inner masculine and feminine forces, reason and feeling, action and receptivity, begin to seek one another. This is when the journey enters its next chapter, where Jung invites us to listen to Anima and Animus, the bridges linking the ego to the depths of the unconscious, opening the possibility of inner harmony. When the shadow has been acknowledged and is no longer pushed to the margins of consciousness, a profound quieting emerges within the psyche. The struggle between who I should be and who I am not allowed to be gradually subsides. Energy, once buried, begins to flow again, not violently, but with a subtler rhythm. It is precisely within this softened space that another voice arises, not confrontational, not demanding, but inviting. Jung called this voice Anima and Animus. If the shadow consists of what was rejected for failing to conform to moral norms or social images, then Anima and Animus are the parts forgotten for failing to conform to the psychological gender one was taught to become. Jung observed that within every man exists an inner feminine element, Anima, and within every woman exists an inner masculine element, Animus. This is not a biological issue, but a deep psychological structure of the psyche. Jung wrote, "Every man carries within him the eternal image of woman, not the image of this or that particular woman, but a definite feminine image." Collected Works, Volume 9I. And he said similarly of women. The Animus is the deposit, as it were, of all women, ancestral experiences of man. Collected Works, Volume 9I. Anima and Animus are not social roles, nor are they simple personality traits. They are bridges linking the ego to the depths of the unconscious. When the ego has become sufficiently stable, no longer dominated by the shadow, it gains the capacity to listen. And Anima, Animus are the first guides to appear. In men, Anima often manifests as emotion, intuition, receptivity, and the capacity to connect with inner life. When neglected, Anima does not disappear. It expresses itself through melancholy, emotional instability, or blindly dependent relationships. Jung warned that a man without a healthy relationship to his anima is often ruled by emotions without realizing it. The anima is the archetype of life itself. Collected Works, Volume 9I. In women, Animus manifests as thinking direction, strength of will, and the ability to stand firmly in the world. When Animus is repressed or distorted, it may become an inner judging voice, rigidity of belief, or opinions held with absolute certainty, yet disconnected from living feeling. Jung described this plainly. The animus is a personification of the unconscious mind. Collected Works, Volume 9I. What matters is this: anima and animus do not seek domination. They seek to be heard. When the ego is no longer in a state of constant defense, when the shadow has been at least partially integrated, these archetypes begin to function as mediators. They bring unconscious contents to the surface, not through shock, but through images, emotions, intuitions, and above all, through relationships. Jung recognized that many emotional conflicts are not truly problems between two people, but projections of anima or animus. We love, hate, idealize, or despair, not only because of the other person, but because they carry an inner image we have never consciously recognized. He wrote, "Projection is one of the commonest psychic phenomena." Collected Works, Volume 6. When anima, animus, remain unconscious, we search for them outside ourselves. When they are recognized, a profound shift occurs. The center of gravity returns inward. We no longer need another person to complete us. We begin to cultivate balance from within. Sleep and dreaming provide a privileged space for this process. Anima and animus often appear in dreams as dialogical figures: a strange woman, an unfamiliar man, a guide, a challenger. Jung did not advise rigid interpretation. He advised listening to their attitude. Dreams are the guiding words of the soul. Collected Works, Volume 10. When the ego learns to listen without attempting control, anima and animus become sources of meaning. Anima brings depth sensitivity and the capacity for non-possessive love. Animus brings direction, clarity, and the capacity for non-violent action. This is not a feminization or masculinization, but an inner harmony. In the context of motivation, Jung offers a message very different from modern slogans. Meaning in life does not come from becoming stronger, faster, or better. It arises from balance between inner opposites. A man who learns to listen to his emotions does not become weaker. He becomes deeper. A woman who stands firmly in thought and action does not lose her gentleness. She becomes more whole. Jung wrote a guiding sentence. The meeting of two personalities is like the contact of two chemical substances. If there is any reaction, both are transformed. Collected Works, Volume 17. Yet lasting transformation occurs only when the first meeting takes place within. When Anima and Animus are invited into dialogue, the psyche is no longer fragmented. The ego no longer strains between extremes. A deeper sense of meaning emerges, not because every question has been answered, but because the person is no longer divided against themselves. And as this harmony gradually stabilizes, as inner voices cease to compete and begin to complement one another, the psyche naturally moves toward a new mode of communication with the unconscious. No longer merely scattered symbols, but more structured messages, deeper guiding indications. Here dreams do not merely reflect, they write letters. They do not merely compensate, they guide. This is the moment when a person begins to enter a new relationship with the unconscious, where nocturnal images are no longer anxious mysteries, but a familiar language of the soul. And from this very relationship, a new chapter of the journey opens, where dreams are no longer seen as random products, but as letters sent from the depths, waiting to be read with patience and respect. When Anima and Animus begin to converse in silence, when the two opposing halves of the psyche find a shared rhythm, inner life is no longer fragmented. From this point of harmony, the unconscious no longer needs to knock at the door with rough blows. It chooses a subtler path, older and more compassionate dreams. If Anima and Animus are bridges, then dreams are letters sent across those bridges, quiet, non-coercive, yet persistent and precise. Jung did not regard dreams as random products of a tired brain. He saw them as the symbolic language of the soul, where the unconscious speaks in images when words are no longer sufficient. He wrote, "Dreams are the natural expression of the unconscious psyche." Collected Works, Volume 8. In this language, there is no concept of right or wrong according to daytime logic. There is meaning according to a deeper order. Every image, every situation, every emotion in a dream is an effort of the psyche to restore balance. Jung called this the compensatory function of dreams. When consciousness moves too far in one direction, too rational, too controlling, too confident, or too self-doubting, the unconscious responds with a counterbalancing message. He expressed this succinctly. The dream shows the inner truth and reality of the patient as it really is. Collected works. Volume 16. Compensation does not mean opposition. It means completion. A person who lives too strongly by day may dream of helplessness, not to humiliate, but to invite forgotten softness. A person overly dependent on emotion may dream of cold, sharp images, not to deny feeling, but to awaken the capacity for discernment. Dreams do not moralize. They are precise. Modern people often complain that they do not remember their dreams. Jung argued that this does not mean one does not dream, but rather reflects a distance between consciousness and the unconscious. He reminded us, we dream every night, but the unconscious is ignored in waking life. Man and his symbols. That distance makes dreams feel alien, even frightening. But when the inner relationship has been prepared through recognizing the persona, integrating the shadow, and listening to Anima, Animus, dreams change their tone. They no longer shout. They write letters. These letters do not demand hurried decoding. They ask to be read slowly. Jung emphasized that dreams speak in symbols, not concepts. A symbol is not an arbitrary metaphor. It is an image that carries multiple layers of meaning, both personal and universal. A house may be the body, the family, or the psyche. A road may be one's life direction, a decision, or the process of individuation. Jung wrote, "The symbol is the best possible expression for something unknown." Collected Works. Volume 6. Approaching dreams, therefore, is not about solving a problem. It is about establishing a relationship. When we ask, what does this dream want from me, rather than, what does this dream mean, we shift from control to listening. And it is precisely this attitude that opens access to the wisdom of the unconscious. In sleep, the ego temporarily recedes. Linear time dissolves. Memory is no longer bound to the familiar life story. In this way, the psyche can reorganize energy, reconnect scattered fragments, and point out where consciousness has gone astray. Jung stated clearly, dreams are compensatory to the conscious situation of the moment. Collected Works, Volume 8. It is important to note that dreams are not always pleasant. A truthful letter does not always comfort. Some dreams provoke anxiety, shame, or fear. Jung did not advise avoidance. he advised enduring their meaning. For it is often in disturbing dreams that the most vital information is held, where the psyche reveals what has been avoided during the day. Dreams are also where archetypes appear with greatest intensity. The wise old man, the child, the animal, the stranger. These are images carrying collective wisdom, arriving to orient the psyche. Jung called dreams the guiding organ of the psyche. Dreams are the guiding words of the soul. Collected Works, Volume 10. In the context of motivation, this message carries particular power. You do not need an external formula to live correctly. Your psyche already contains a map. Dreams are how that map redraws itself each night, according to the path you have walked during the day. When you listen, you lose your way less. When you ignore them, you are not wrong. You are simply walking at night without turning on the light. What Jung invited was not obsession with dreams, but respect. Respect by remembering an image, a feeling, a question. Respect by allowing dreams to dialogue with waking life. When this dialogue is established, a subtle change occurs. Daytime decisions become less forced. Relationships become less repetitive. A sense of being in the right place appears more often. Jung directly linked dreams to the process of individuation. The dream is a little hidden door in the innermost and most secret recesses of the soul. Collected Works, Volume 10. That small door does not lead outward, but inward. Each letter does not say, become someone else. It says, return. Return to your own rhythm, your own balance, your own truth, waiting to be lived. And when dreams are received as trustworthy messengers, the psyche becomes ready for a more active step. Not only receiving letters, but writing replies. Not only listening, but entering into dialogue. Here Jung introduced a unique practice, one in which consciousness and the unconscious meet in wakefulness without waiting for night. This is when the journey moves into its next chapter. Active imagination, where human beings learn to enter into conscious dialogue with images that once appeared only in dreams. When the letters of dreams have been read with patience, when nocturnal images are no longer dismissed as random occurrences, a natural need arises within the psyche, not only to listen, but to respond. Dreams have spoken. The question now is whether consciousness has the courage to enter into dialogue. It is precisely at this threshold that Jung opened a bold path: active imagination. If dreams are messages that arrive during sleep, then active imagination is the encounter that takes place in wakefulness. Jung did not regard this as a relaxation technique, or spontaneous creativity. He understood it as a serious form of dialogue between the ego and the unconscious, where the ego no longer monopolizes speech, but learns to listen to inner figures as entities with voices of their own. He wrote, "Active imagination is a way of experiencing the unconscious consciously." Collected Works, Volume 14. This requires an attitude very different from ordinary thinking. It is not imagining in order to control images, but allowing images to arise on their own. Not directing the story, but remaining with its unfolding. Jung described this experience as entering an intermediate world where symbols cease to be concepts and become characters. In active imagination, the ego is invited to step aside, but not to disappear. It retains the role of witness recorder and dialogue partner rather than director. When the ego is sufficiently stable not to be swept away, the unconscious begins to speak in its own language. Images, emotions, gestures, dialogues. Jung wrote, "The images of the unconscious place a great responsibility upon a man." Collected Works, Volume 9I. That responsibility lies in facing what appears. What emerges in active imagination is not always pleasant. The shadow may speak. Anima or Animus may challenge. Long-suppressed conflicts may take form. But unlike dreams, where we are often only observers here, we can ask questions, reply, and remain present. Jung believed that this very capacity to remain is what creates transformation. He emphasized a key principle. The essential thing is to differentiate oneself from these contents by personifying them. Collected Works, Volume 7. Personification is not fantasy. It is how the ego establishes boundaries. When an emotion is named, when an image is addressed in dialogue, it no longer seizes control from the darkness. Energy, once trapped in conflict, begins to move. This is why Jung regarded active imagination as a form of self-therapy, not a replacement for analysis, but a complement to it through direct experience. In this process, inner gods appear not in a religious sense, but in an archetypal one. The wise old teacher, the goddess, the warrior, the child, the destroyer, all are expressions of deep psychological forces. Jung wrote, "The gods have become diseases." Psychology and religion. This statement is not pessimistic. It points out that forces once revered outwardly now live within the psyche of modern human beings. When they are not recognized, they manifest as symptoms. When they are engaged in dialogue, they become sources of wisdom. Active imagination is a way of bringing these gods into the light of consciousness, not to worship them, but to cooperate with them. The core of this practice does not lie in strange imagery, but in the ethical attitude of the ego. Jung warned that if the ego is too weak, active, imagination can become disorienting. If the ego is too strong, it will suffocate the process. This delicate balance demands inner discipline. He wrote, "One must have a firm standpoint in consciousness." Collected Works, Volume 14. When practiced correctly, active imagination creates a space of reconciliation. The shadow no longer needs to sabotage in order to be noticed. Anima and Animus no longer need to be projected onto others. Inner conflicts begin to speak with one another, rather than fight behind the scenes. From here, creativity emerges not as impulsive inspiration, but as an ordered flow. Jung perceived a deep connection between active imagination and art. He believed that many great works arise not from personal talent alone, but from the capacity to engage honestly with the unconscious. He wrote, "The creative process has a feminine quality, and the creative work arises from the depths of the unconscious." Collected Works, Volume 15. In the context of motivation, this is a very different invitation. You do not need to force yourself to be more positive or stronger. You need to listen more deeply. When the unconscious is invited to the table of dialogue, inner life becomes less tense. Decisions ripen. Choices carry a sense of being in the right place. Active imagination also transforms how we understand healing. Healing is not the rapid elimination of symptoms. It is the establishment of a long-term relationship with parts that were once abandoned. Jung wrote, "Healing comes from taking responsibility for the unconscious." Collected Works, Volume 11. That responsibility is not a burden. It is liberating when people no longer flee from their inner life. They are less compelled to seek salvation outside themselves. A new trust forms, not blind faith, but trust in the deep order of the psyche. And when inner dialogue becomes regular, a subtle phenomenon appears. Images no longer arrive randomly. Encounters in daily life begin to carry resonant meaning. The outer world seems to respond to inner movements. Jung did not regard this as superstition. He saw it as the emergence of a hidden order. From this point, the journey prepares to enter a new chapter where the relationship between mind and world is no longer viewed as a simple chain of cause and effect. Here, meaningful coincidences arise as guiding signs suggesting that psyche and reality may be mirroring one another. This is where Jung invites us to look more deeply into the phenomenon he called synchronicity, the meaningful alignment between inner and outer worlds where dialogue no longer takes place only within the mind, but extends into the fabric of life itself. When the letters of dreams have been read with patience, when nocturnal images are no longer dismissed as random occurrences, a natural need arises within the psyche, not only to listen, but to respond. Dreams have spoken. The question now is whether consciousness has the courage to enter into dialogue. It is precisely at this threshold that Jung opened a bold path: active imagination. If dreams are messages that arrive during sleep, then active imagination is the encounter that takes place in wakefulness. Jung did not regard this as a relaxation technique or spontaneous creativity. He understood it as a serious form of dialogue between the ego and the unconscious, where the ego no longer monopolizes speech, but learns to listen to inner figures as entities with voices of their own. He wrote, "Active imagination is a way of experiencing the unconscious consciously." Collected Works, Volume 14. This requires an attitude very different from ordinary thinking. It is not imagining in order to control images, but allowing images to arise on their own, not directing the story, but remaining with its unfolding. Jung described this experience as entering an intermediate world where symbols cease to be concepts and become characters. In active imagination, the ego is invited to step aside, but not to disappear. It retains the role of witness, recorder, and dialogue partner, rather than director. When the ego is sufficiently stable not to be swept away, the unconscious begins to speak in its own language. Images, emotions, gestures, dialogues. Jung wrote, "The images of the unconscious place a great responsibility upon a man." Collected Works, Volume 10. That responsibility lies in facing what appears. What emerges in active imagination is not always pleasant. The shadow may speak. Anima or Animus may challenge. Long-suppressed conflicts may take form. But unlike dreams where we are often only observers, here we can ask questions, reply, and remain present. Jung believed that this very capacity to remain is what creates transformation. He emphasized a key principle. The essential thing is to differentiate oneself from these contents by personifying them. Collected Works, Volume 7. Personification is not fantasy. It is how the ego establishes boundaries. When an emotion is named, when an image is addressed in dialogue, it no longer seizes control from the darkness. Energy, once trapped in conflict, begins to move. This is why Jung regarded active imagination as a form of self-therapy, not a replacement for analysis, but a complement to it through direct experience. In this process, inner gods appear not in a religious sense, but in an archetypal one. The wise old teacher, the goddess, the warrior, the child, the destroyer, all are expressions of deep psychological forces. Jung wrote, "The gods have become diseases." Psychology and religion. This statement is not pessimistic. It points out that forces once revered outwardly now live within the psyche of modern human beings. When they are not recognized, they manifest as symptoms. When they are engaged in dialogue, they become sources of wisdom. Active imagination is a way of bringing these gods into the light of consciousness, not to worship them, but to cooperate with them. The core of this practice does not lie in strange imagery, but in the ethical attitude of the ego. Jung warned that if the ego is too weak, active imagination can become disorienting. If the ego is too strong, it will suffocate the process. This delicate balance demands inner discipline. He wrote, "One must have a firm standpoint in consciousness." Collected Works, Volume 14. When practiced correctly, active imagination creates a space of reconciliation. The shadow no longer needs to sabotage in order to be noticed. Anima and Animus no longer need to be projected onto others. Inner conflicts begin to speak with one another, rather than fight behind the scenes. From here, creativity emerges not as impulsive inspiration, but as an ordered flow. Jung perceived a deep connection between active imagination and art. He believed that many great works arise not from personal talent alone, but from the capacity to engage honestly with the unconscious. He wrote, "The creative process has a feminine quality, and the creative work arises from the depths of the unconscious." Collected Works, Volume 15. In the context of motivation, this is a very different invitation. You do not need to force yourself to be more positive or stronger. You need to listen more deeply. When the unconscious is invited to the table of dialogue, inner life becomes less tense. Decisions ripen. Choices carry a sense of being in the right place. Active imagination also transforms how we understand healing. Healing is not the rapid elimination of symptoms. It is the establishment of a long-term relationship with parts that were once abandoned. Jung wrote, "Healing comes from taking responsibility for the unconscious." Collected Works, Volume 11. That responsibility is not a burden. It is liberating. When people no longer flee from their inner life, they are less compelled to seek salvation outside themselves. A new trust forms not blind faith, but trust in the deep order of the psyche. And when inner dialogue becomes regular, a subtle phenomenon appears. Images no longer arrive randomly. Encounters in daily life begin to carry resonant meaning. The outer world seems to respond to inner movements. Jung did not regard this as superstition. He saw it as the emergence of a hidden order. From this point, the journey prepares to enter a new chapter where the relationship between mind and world is no longer viewed as a simple chain of cause and effect. Here, meaningful coincidences arise as guiding signs suggesting that psyche and reality may be mirroring one another. This is where Jung invites us to look more deeply into the phenomenon he called synchronicity, the meaningful alignment between inner and outer worlds, where dialogue no longer takes place only within the mind, but extends into the fabric of life itself. When meaningful coincidences have appeared often enough that you no longer see the world as a series of disconnected events, when the inner and the outer begin to mirror one another. In silence, the journey no longer needs to go any farther. Not because there is nothing left to explore, but because the destination is not ahead. It lies at the center. Jung called this center the self. If the ego is the center of consciousness, then the self is the center of the entire psyche. It includes not only what you know about yourself, but also everything you have never dared to acknowledge, never fully understood, and never completely lived. Jung did not describe the self as a philosophical concept, but as a living reality, operating quietly yet persistently within every human being. He wrote, "The self is not only the center, but also the whole circumference, which embraces both conscious and unconscious collected works." Volume 12. Here, a common misunderstanding must be released. The self is not a higher ego, nor is it a state of perfect enlightenment. The self does not eliminate contradiction. It contains contradiction. Light and darkness, masculine and feminine, reason and instinct, order and chaos all coexist within a living totality. Wholeness is not the absence of conflict, but the absence of inner fragmentation caused by conflict. Jung emphasized that the deepest aim of human life is not social success or moral perfection, but individuation. This does not mean becoming more special than others, but becoming more whole with oneself. He wrote, "Individuation means becoming an individual, and insofar as individuality embraces our innermost, last, and incomparable uniqueness, it also implies becoming one's own self." Collected Works, Volume 7. Individuation is not a straight path. It is a spiral. One returns to old themes at deeper levels with wider awareness. The ego learns to serve the self rather than dominate psychic life. When this happens, Life does not become easier in the conventional sense, but it becomes more meaningful. Jung stated this plainly. The goal of life is not happiness, but completeness. Collected Works, Volume 11. Happiness is a state. Wholeness is a process. And that process does not demand that you remake yourself into someone else. It invites you to stop fleeing from the parts that already belong to you. When the shadow has been integrated, when Anima and Animus have been heard, when dreams are respected, when the outer world reflects the inner rhythm, the self does not arrive as a dramatic event. It reveals itself as a deep sense of inner steadiness. In this state, the compulsion to prove one as worth falls away, not because one is good enough, but because one is no longer cut off from the inner source of life. Jung called this the shift from living by the ego to living in relationship with the self. He wrote, "The ego is not master in its own house." Collected Works, Volume 7. This sentence does not diminish the ego. It frees the ego from the burden of having to control everything. When the ego is no longer forced to occupy the absolute center, it can rest. And in that rest, the self becomes the quiet reference point for every choice, every relationship, every movement of life. The self often appears in dreams through images of wholeness. Circles, mandalas, a central house, the divine child, or a guiding figure that no longer provokes conflict. Jung regarded the mandala as the most ancient symbol of the self. He wrote, "The mandala is the psychological expression of the totality of the self." Collected Works, Volume 9I. But what matters most is this: the self does not exist only in symbols. It is lived in very ordinary moments. When you act without betraying yourself, when you say no without needing to justify it, when you accept a limitation without shame, when you stop asking, "Who should I become?" and begin asking, "What is seeking to live through me?" In the context of motivation, this is a countercurrent yet profound message. You do not need to become a perfect version of yourself. You need to become an honest one. Jung did not promise absolute safety. He promised inner congruence, a sense that your life, with all its turns, is being lived from the center rather than from the margins. Jung wrote, "Wholeness is not achieved by cutting off a portion of one's being, but by integration of the contraries." Collected Works, Volume 14. And when that integration takes place, something very gentle happens. People stop rushing, not because they abandon aspiration, but because they are no longer running from the present. Time ceases to be a pursuer. It becomes a current. You sense yourself as part of something larger, not to dissolve into it, but to be supported by it. Here, Jung touches a dimension close to spirituality, yet never separated from psychology. He did not speak of transcendence away from life, but of full presence within life. He wrote, "The self is a quantity that is supraordinate to the conscious ego. Collected works. Volleren 9. Supraordinate above, yet not negating. The self does not erase individuality. It completes it. You remain you with your history, temperament, and limits, but you no longer live from a sense of lack. Not because you have everything, but because you are no longer divided. And thus, the final chapter of the journey does not end with a call to action, but with an invitation to rest. Rest is not the cessation of living. It is the cessation of resistance against oneself. When you allow yourself to be here in this moment with your whole being, including the imperfect parts, you are standing very close to the center of the self. Jung did not conclude with a promise. He concluded with a simple truth. Life has always seemed to me like a plant that lives on its rhizome. Memories, dreams, reflections. The roots live underground, unseen, unhurried. Yet from them, everything grows. The self is the same. It does not need to be achieved. It needs to be allowed. And in that allowing, you may rest not because every question has been answered, but because you are in the right place. And now there is nothing more you need to understand. There is nothing more you need to become. If any thought is still passing by, let it pass. If any feeling has not yet been named, let it remain. You do not need to fix anything, nor hold on to anything. Every part within you has been seen enough for tonight. Let consciousness be set down like the last heavy object released from the hand, and allow sleep to arrive in its own rhythm, slow, natural, without effort. You are in the right place. You are safe enough to rest. Wishing you a deep and peaceful sleep.